Okay. Kinnot each year are a relatively difficult experience. Right? These were poems written by many individuals over the course of Jewish history that meant a massive amount to them because they were really informed by their own experience. And to be able to relate to that in the world that we live in, it's not so simple, not so easy to do. And so as I was reflecting upon how to prepare for Kinnot this year, I wanted to take a little bit of an unconventional direction. Wanted to focus on the lives of 4 people. And we're going to spend the next foreseeable few minutes, maximum, I believe, 45 minutes, maybe an hour at most, talking about the lives of and the legacies of 4 people who had a really massive and outsized impact, definitely on the Jewish world, but I believe on the world at large. But the question before we talk about them and their lives, right? We're here today, sitting on the floor, reading Kinnot, reading about the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, and there's a fundamental question: why are we learning about the lives of people when we're mourning a building? How does mourning a building and the lives of these people connect? How does that work together? Right? What's the legacies of people's lives got to do with the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash? So it happens to be in this week's parsha, V'eschanan, right? Moshe Rabbeinu pleads with God. Right? Moshe Rabbeinu is desperate to go into the land. And what does God say to Moshe Rabbeinu? V'yisaber Hashem b'lamanchem, v'lo shema Elai. V'yom Hashem Elai ravlach al tosef daber Elai od b'devar zeh. Moshe Rabbeinu is reporting to the Jewish people the conversation that he had with God. And how does it go? Moshe says, the Lord was angry, he was wrathful. On your account, he would not listen to me. Right? That sounds like a very angry reaction of Moshe. Why is Moshe so angry towards the Jewish people? This is years later. Why is Moshe so angry? He said, the Lord said to me, enough, never speak to me again. Rav lach al tosef taber elai, od b'devar zeh. Don't talk to me about this matter again. So 2 things that strike us immediately about this passage. Number 1, Hashem says, enough, stop talking to me about this. And number 2 is Moshe's anger is translated to the Jewish people. The reason I'm not going in is because of you. Now, our entire lives, we've heard this pasuk, and we've been provoked to think that Moshe is blaming the Jewish people for not going into the land of Israel. But when we recall the story, it's Moshe who hit the rock instead of speaking to the rock. It was Moshe's action. So what kind of responsibility is that? To blame the people still? He's breathing his last breaths and he's still blaming the people? So along comes the Malbim, one of the classic commentators of the 19th century. And he says the following. He says, had Moshe entered the promised land, had Moshe entered the land of Israel, he would have built the temple, which would have become a permanent structure, prevented from destruction. Had Moshe entered the land of Israel, he would have been the one to lead the construction of the Beis Hamikdash, and it would have been permanent. There would have only ever have been one Beis Hamikdash. And then later in our parsha, it says, "Ve'ifitz Hashem eschem ba'amim v'nish'artim nesei mispar b'goyim asher yina'ig Hashem etchem b'shama." What's going to happen? It's going to happen that God is going to get angry at us. The Lord will scatter you among the peoples. Only a scant few of you shall remain among the nations of the world, and the Lord will drive you from the promised land. Along comes the Malbim again. And he says the following: this as well he will do to save you. He will not exile you to one place, but will scatter you in order that you be dispersed among the nations. For then If they enact decrees and destruction in one place, you will find space and rescue in another. Thus, a remnant will always remain. Although a few in number, nonetheless, you shall not entirely be destroyed. A man could rise in Europe and decide to destroy, wipe out the entire Jewish people, and he would be practically incapable of doing so. This was a deliberate design by God. Scatter the Jewish people across the world. So the Malbim is picking up on the language of Moshe. It's because of you, God told me to stop asking to go into the land of Israel. There's this incredible midrash recorded in Eicha Rabbah. It's a long midrash about the back and forth, the reactions of the angels when the temple was being destroyed. And along comes this angel Asaph, and he is singing songs. He's singing praises. Kach amur la'asaf. They say to Asaph, what are you doing? The Beis HaMikdash is burning. It's being destroyed. You're singing song? What are you doing? What does Asaph respond? Kadosh Baruch Hu hechariv heichal u'mikdash. God destroyed his heichal. He destroyed his mikdash. V'ata yoshev u'mezamer. You sing? Amar lahem. He responded to them. Mezamer ani. I sing today. Sheshafach HaKadosh Baruch Hu chamaso ala eitzim v'al havanim. Because God became angry and showed his anger against sticks and stones. V'lo shafach chamaso al Yisrael. God could have destroyed the Jewish people. We were worthy of destruction. But God poured out his wrath on his building, on his home, instead of on us. So why doesn't Moshe go into the promised land? Because if Moshe goes in, the Beis HaMikdash becomes permanent, becomes indestructible. And when God grows angry with the Jewish people, he only has one choice. He can't destroy the Beis HaMikdash, he can only destroy the people. And so God prevents Moshe from going into the land so that the Beis HaMikdash can be destroyed and the people can be protected. God scatters us across the world so that the people can be protected. Because in the end of the day, that's God's ultimate goal, is to protect his people. No matter how bad we grow, no matter how many Averos we do, God has built it into the system, even to the extent that he prevents Moshe from going into the promised land. He builds it into the system, the safety to protect the people. That's why Moshe says it's because of you I don't go into the promised land. And so we're going to study people this morning because God chose not to destroy us. He chose to destroy his building. Before we dive into the lives of these four fascinating people, we're going to begin by reciting two Kinnot. Both of these Kinnot can be found, all the Kinnot we recite today are going to be found in the new Kinnot book that we have. We're going to begin with the first two, Kinnot number 6 and Kinnot number 7. We recite these two Kinnot for two reasons. Reason number one is Kinnot number 6 invokes the phrase, Ki tam chakta b'chis ofanecha, that God engraves the image of Yaakov on his throne. When Yaakov falls asleep, he's running away. Remember, he's running away for his life from Esau, and he's overwhelmed. This is his first night away from home, away from his parents, and he falls asleep, and he dreams of angels going up and down a ladder. And the pasuk says, Olim v'yordim bo. And we've always, our entire lives, read that pasuk, that the angels are going Olim v'yordim bo, they're going up and down the ladder. It's also possible to read the words Olim v'yordim bo that they're going up and down on Yaakov himself. Olim v'yardim bo. They look at the top of the ladder and they see the throne of Yaakov, and they see the image of Yaakov engraved on God's throne. And they say, wow, how extraordinary, how amazing is humanity. God chose to engrave the image of humanity of Yaakov on his own throne. And then they look at the bottom of the ladder, and there is human, frail, afraid Yaakov sleeping. Olim v'yardim bo, the angels don't know, which is it? Is humanity engraved on the throne of God, or is humanity completely frail, vulnerable to the world? And so in the first Kinnot, we mentioned that God engraves us on his throne to remind us of our potential. And the second Kinnot that we're going to read momentarily is Kinnot number 7. Kinnot number 7 starts a series of Kinnots that raise a series of questions. As we mentioned last night, asking questions of God is a dangerous thing to do, right? Anyone who's read the story of Iyov, the idea of asking questions and the power and the fraughtness of asking questions is driven home. The only reason we are permitted to ask questions of God is because Yirmiyahu is taught to do so by God himself. And so one of the things we're going to try and achieve this morning is to ask some pretty, I hope, insightful, pretty deep questions about humanity, about the potential for goodness and the potential for evil within each of us. We're going to continue now with the recitation of Kinnot number 6, Kinnot number 7, beginning on page 195 and continuing on page 217, silently to ourselves. זקן וחבשו לקבל רע מפתנם חכו לנו זכר אדוני מההיה לנו. איכה עצת ובעתך. זכרי ביוסי יושבת בשער וירושלים גנצי ואתה עד חוק שמיים. So if you're still reciting Kinnot, please continue. The four lives we're going to explore today, Rabbi Eliezer of Worms, who is more commonly known as the Rokeach, lived in France-German border. Theme that we're going to try and tease out in his life, his personal tragedy, really remarkable resilience. Titus HaRasha, the destroyer of the Beis Hamikdash. Theme in his life is evil and destruction. Chana Senesh, remarkable strength, woman born in Hungary, moved to then British Mandate Palestine, and Dr. Fritz Haber. Theme is good and evil. We're going to begin with the Rokeach, Rabbi Eliezer of Worms. Let's set the scene a little bit. I remember the Rokeach lives in the mid to late 12th century. So what's going on for the Jewish people in the 12th century? Remember, the Crusades launched in 1096. Pope Urban has a massive problem. The Christian empire is divided between two popes. There's a whole host of knights that have nothing to do, and knights not like the knights that we imagine. These are like young guys who are sitting around just causing trouble. And Pope Urban comes up with a solution to combine the two, and he calls, for the first time in history, a crusade to redeem the holy city of Jerusalem from the hand of the infidels. Remember, Jerusalem had now been in Muslim control for over 400 years. And so in some nondescript field somewhere in the middle of France, Pope Urban declares the first crusade in 1096. And he has a problem. He can't say now is the moment to get rid of the infidels from Jerusalem. Why? Because the Muslims have been in control of Jerusalem for over 400 years. What provokes the Crusades now? So one thing in specific that Urban invokes, there are rumors that the Muslims are preventing good faith Christians from worshiping at their holy sites in Jerusalem. The idea that people would prevent people from worshiping is what Urban uses to stoke the fires. And the armies, average people led by the knights, travel across Europe, pillaging and raping and killing wherever they go. Why? Because the issue isn't liberating Jerusalem. The issue is people. Urban has identified the issue as infidels, people who are non-believers in Jesus. And so wherever they go, wherever they find a non-believer in Jesus, they kill that person. And they travel across Europe, causing death and destruction. and it leaves such a profound mark. Hundreds of thousands of people. And after the First Crusade is successful with some setbacks along the way, but after they're successful and they've conquered Jerusalem in 1099, the general consensus amongst the soldiers, because we have this perception that the crusade was enriching. But if you joined the crusade, you got all the wealth, right? You conquered all of these Muslim armies, you conquered all of these Muslim cities, you got all of their gold, and you got all of their land. And it was a devastating experience for a Christian soldier. They gave up everything. It was driven purely by faith. They gave up all their money to buy a horse, all their money to buy weaponry and defense. It was massive sacrifice to go and liberate Jerusalem. And so the general consensus after 1099 was, if this is about killing infidels, why do I need to travel to Jerusalem to do so? My neighbor's an infidel. If you lived in Paris, you knew Jews. If you lived in Barcelona, you knew Jews. If you lived in the Rhineland, you knew Jews. Why do I need to travel to the other side of the world to kill Muslims when I can kill Jews here? And so the environment in the 12th century, 100 years following the First Crusade, was an incredibly dangerous environment for the Jewish people of Europe. The flip side of that was it was actually an incredibly golden age for the Jewish communities of Europe. There were 3 large communities in Western Europe that you probably heard of because they're significant: Worms, Mainz, and Speyer. Who's the most famous rabbi to come out of these 3 communities? Rashi. Which one of them does he come out of? Worms. Worms, Mainz, and Speyer. In 2021, UNESCO recognizes Worms, Mainz, and Speyer as a World Heritage Site for its history with the Jewish people. And Tablet Magazine records a beautiful history, beautiful summary of what these communities meant. In July 2021, 3 cities along the German Rhine, Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, collectively promoted as the cradle of European Jewry, were together declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Jews have been present in this region since the 9th century, with Jewish communities established in the 10th and the 11th century. In the grassy fields of Worms, the moss-covered gravestones leaning left and right mark the oldest surviving Jewish cemetery in Europe. In Speyer, stone steps lead into a pool of the oldest surviving mikveh in Europe. And in Mainz, fragments of an Ashkenazi Jewish cemetery found around the same time as that in Worms, time and again desecrated, yet remain. Speyer and Mainz are 60 miles apart, with Worms roughly halfway between the two. They are known collectively as Shum cities, an acronym uniting the letters of the city's medieval Hebrew names, Shin, Vav, Mem. Shum also means garlic in Hebrew. 16th century drawings of Jewish merchants from the region portray a sprig of garlic in one hand to signal geographical origin, and a yellow circle emblazoned on their robes to signal Jewish identity. Shum was not a garlic-growing region. This linkage emerged from the Hebrew meaning of the acronym paired with anti-Semitic associations, i.e., the stench of garlic associated with Jews. These holy communities, they came to identify themselves as Jerusalem on the Rhine, with the 11th century building of the Worms synagogue, including replicas of 2 pillars from the Solomonic temple in Jerusalem, having long been recognized as the bastion of Ashkenazi Judaism, beginning a millennium ago and continuing to influence Jewish culture, architecture, religious practice, and religious thought to this very day. Historian Matthias Preisler cautions in his book, Die Shum Stadt Speyer Worms Mainz, that the linked histories of these three cities are not only stories of Jewish flourishing, but also like those of all European Jews, marked by many periods of persecution. Perhaps most notable among these were the Rhineland massacres in 1096, the Black Death persecutions that began in 1347, culminating in the massacres of the Jewish communities blamed for spreading the plague, and of course, the Holocaust. Mainz, in particular, has been a site of relentless Jewish persecution, a fact that reveals itself in its few remaining pre-modern Jewish structures. The Worms synagogue served as a model for synagogues later rebuilt in Regensburg, Krakow, Vienna, and Prague. Among renowned rabbis who hailed from this region, Gershom ben Yehuda, known in Hebrew as Light of Diaspora, right, Takanos Rabbeinu Gershom, right, the reason why we have all these different takanos, why we don't practice polygamy, why we don't check each other's mail, was Rabbeinu Gershom, who lived here. Gershom ben Yehuda, and recognized for his Talmudic commentaries, resided in Mainz during the 10th and 11th centuries. Other notable rabbis, including Yehuda HaChassid of Speyer, Rokeach of Speyer, Mainz, Maharam of Worms, Maharil of Worms, their commentaries and codifications of religious observance continue to be studied and lived in Ashkenazi communities worldwide. A popular legend recorded in the 13th century attributes the composition of Unatane Tokef to Rabbi Abnon of Mainz. As Urban found it very ironic, there's a historian that is interviewed in this article. I didn't include the introduction to the historian, but her name is Urban, which is the same name of the Pope that launches the Crusades 1,000 years earlier. As Urban noted in this endurance of the city's Jewish heritage, it's not only monuments, tombstones, but there is also something tangible and very lively behind it. The liturgy and the prayers from Shum are still spoken in Ashkenazi synagogues around the world. So let's talk about the Rokeach. Rabbi Eliezer of Worms, a brilliant man, lived as a rabbi in Worms, lived with the grandchildren of Rashi. He was well known to Rabbeinu Tam, the Rashbam. He was a contemporary and a widely respected posek. And immediately following the Crusades, there was a series of other attacks that causes the Rokeach to write a tefillah, to write a prayer in response. He writes as follows: Tefillah Moshe, a prayer for Moshe. Shanos ra'inu ra'a, years in which we have seen evil. Begalosenu kmo ata b'taf kuf memches. In our exile, currently in the year 1188. Shenilchamu Yishmaelim be'edom yachad al Yerushalayim, in which the Muslims and the Christians are fighting over Jerusalem. Umigazmim osanu kol hagayim nerag etchem tchila va'anachnu mitzapim le'ezras boreinu lahagen aleinu. They're fighting for Jerusalem. And all the Gentiles taunt us, saying, we will kill you first. And we are hoping for God, for the assistance of our Creator to protect us speedily. We do not know what to do, and our souls are in our hands. The fear amongst the community, this is 100 years after the First Crusade, and they were still living with tangible fear, living via prayers, hoping for God's intervention. And then the worst event in the Rokeach's life happens. His worst dreams come true. Rabbeinu Nasa Isha Marat Dolcha. The Rokeach was married to a woman, very famous woman, Marat Dolcha, Lady Dolcha of Worms. Bat Chamav Rabbi Eliezer Cohen HaChazan. Me'eshto Zot, Hayalo Shtei Banim. They had two sons. Behem Ben Asher Nifta Apanav B'Kitzur Yamim. One died very, very young, as a baby. Ushtei Banot, Chana Uvilat. and they had 2 daughters. So 2 sons, 2 daughters. One son died very young. Ishto uvnosav nirtzachu lefanav al yedei porim kfi shemisaper Rabbeinu ba'atzmo. The Rokeach himself witnessed the murder of his wife and his children, as he wrote himself. In the year Taf Kuf Nun Zayin, Lefrat Chaf Beis Kislev, on the 22nd day of Kislev, days short of celebrating Hanukkah. La'achar shepeirashti ani hakaton v'ha'aluv, et Parshat Vayeshev Leveta. After I wrote my commentary, after I sat down and studied the Parsha of Vayeshev. Remember what the Parsha of Vayeshev is about? Vayeshev Yaakov. Yaakov is so desperate for some peace. He's so desperate for some just solitude, for some calm. He's come back. Esav is no longer chasing him. All he wants is to live in harmony, to live in peace. The Rokeach writes his commentary on that Parsha. And then the following happens. Vayiti Yoshev al Shulchani, I was sitting at my table. Ba'ur aleinu shnayim mesumanim. What's mesumanim? Anyone know what mesumanim is? How you would translate mesumanim? Carriers of the cross. Crusaders. Wasn't in the middle of a crusade. They were thieves. But he identifies them with the crusaders. They break into his home. They have knives in their hands and they strike my wife. Hachisada, the righteous. Marat Dolce, my beloved Dolce. Uvitia Gdola Bilat Baku Rosha. And they hit my daughter Bilat on the head. Uviti Chana Baku Barosha V'Mesu. And they hit my daughter Chana. And she died immediately. Ufatsu bin Yaakov Migova Rosha. They hit my son Yaakov on the top of his head. Ad Chatzi L'chayo Birkaso. Upatsu Baroshi B'Yadib Smoli. And they attacked me. They hit me. They injured me on my left side, my left hand. Upatsu Talmidei Milamed Shali. And they attacked my student who was studying with me. Umiyad amda hachasida, and straight away, injured, my wife jumped up in her righteousness. V'yatzamid bayit, and she ran outside of the house. Hacharefa hatzaka shahargu otan, and she started screaming, "They're trying to kill us!" V'yatzu hamitovim v'akuha barosha ad hagergeres uvakitaf. They chased after her and they slaughtered her in the streets. Minaktaf ad chaguro v'rochav kalagav lifnim. V'nafla hatzadekes umisa. And there she died. The tzadekes. Anisa gartia pesach. I ran to secure the door. B'tza'akenu, and we cried. At shabo lanu ezem amaro. Until help came. V'tza'akati al hachasida. And I cried, I wailed over the righteous woman. Levakesh nekama, for revenge. And it happened. After a week, they discovered who committed the murders. Who murdered my 2 daughters. And who injured my son. His son dies within a week of him writing this. So he loses his entire family. And they killed him. They killed the murderers. And I spent the rest of my life miserable, suffering. Now, if you were a rabbi in the 12th century, you would be a skilled paitan, be able to write poetry. And if you were the most skilled paitan of the 12th century, and you lost your wife and your children, you would take the most beautiful of poems and you would change it to a Kinnot. And that's what the Rokeach does. I'm just going to read the first few paragraphs, but you'll recognize it straight away. Eshet Chayil Ateret Ba'ala Bat Nadivim Batach Ba'alev Ba'ala Ha'achelito Hilbishito B'chavod Gamlateu Tov V'lo Rak Kol Yemei Hayato Ima Darsha Tzemah Leven L'tzitzit Tota B'chafetz Kapeha Haita Kanit Socher Lahachil Ba'ala La'amik B'Torah V'titein Teref L'veisav Lechem L'na'arim Zriza B'chol Tota L'tfilin L'lilat Sfarim Gidim. What's he doing? He's taking the song Eshes Chayil and dedicating it as a Kinnot for his wife. It's the only example we have in the Middle Ages of one of the rabbis writing a love song for his wife. And not just that, in the column to the left, I've highlighted the first letters of the column. Why? Because the rabbi writes his name into the song. He writes the words Eliezer HaKatan, Aluv Ha'aviman. The small, the dejected, the sad Eliezer. Just to read the English of the Kinnot that he writes for his wife. Her lamp never went out. She prepared wicks for the synagogue and study rooms, and she said psalms. She sang hymns and prayers and recited supplications. Every day she extended her hands to say the prayers beginning with Nishmat Kol Chai and V'chol Ma'aminim. She invoked Pitim HaKatores and the 10 Commandments, and all the cities she taught women, enabling their pleasant intoning of songs. She knew the order of the morning and evening prayers. She came early to the synagogue and she stayed late. She stood throughout the day of atonement and chanted, and she prepared the candles. She honored the Sabbath and the festivals for those who devoted themselves to the study of Torah. Her mouth was full of wisdom. She knew what was forbidden and what was permitted. On the Sabbath, she sat and listened to her husband's preaching. Outstanding in her modesty, she was wise and well-spoken. Whoever was close to her was blessed. She was eager, pious, amiable, and fulfilling all of the commandments. The Rokeach is never the same after he witnesses the murder of his wife, his 2 daughters, and his son. And a large part of the Kinnos that we read on Tisha B'Av are Kinnos dedicated, written by people who witnessed the Crusades. And so we're now going to read 3 Kinnos. First Kinnah is Miyitin Roshi Mayim, Kinnah number 25. Second Kinnah is Me'onish Shamayim Shechakim, Kinnah number 30. And the third Kinnah is Evel A'orer Arninus Agorer, Kinnah number 33. Each written, one by Rabbi Plonimus ben Yehuda of Speyer, one by Rabbi Menachem ben Yaakov of Worms, and one by Rabbi Menachem ben Mechir of Nains. Jerusalem on the Rhine. Written by people who witnessed the Crusades and how bloody and how terrible they were. In the first Kinnah we're going to recite, it says, "V'chodesh hashlishi b'kriyas hala l'shorara." When did the Crusaders attack? They attacked during Hallel. They attacked on Rosh Chodesh. It's the Rokeach himself who records the history of the attack of the Crusaders on Worms. Please begin reciting the 3 Kinnos together.
Zlovo Yaakov Shecho.
If you're still reciting Kinnot, please continue to do so. We're going to move on to Titus Harasha. Titus Harasha, someone we're all familiar with, lives from 39 CE to 81 CE. Right? And he is the general who's in charge of the Roman army at the time of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. He later becomes the emperor of Rome. Let's learn about the life and the impact of Titus Harasha. He gained renown as a military commander, serving under his father Vespasian in the conquering of Britannia and later in the conquering of Judea, a war that begins in the year 66. The campaign to conquer Judea comes to a brief halt in 68, a year in the Roman Empire that would become known as the year of 4 Caesars. Year of 4 Caesars, the Emperor Nero dies, and there are 4 people who claim the throne. They fight it out until July 1, 69. Vespasian becomes emperor, wins the battle, and he leaves Titus in charge of the battle for Jerusalem. Later, Titus will become emperor following his father's demise, and he completes the building of the Colosseum. He's the one who builds the Colosseum in Rome, and he runs extensive relief campaigns after the volcano Vesuvius erupts. He's generally known in terms of Roman emperors, Roman Caesars, as a pretty decent guy. Of course, in our world, he's only known as Titus Harasha. So what did the campaign for Jerusalem look like? It began 3 days before Pesach. The siege happened around Jerusalem that we see in front of us, the map. Titus permitted pilgrims to come into the city, but did not permit any to leave the city. He wants to maximize the difficulty within the city itself. The more people, the more uncomfortable it would be, the more difficult it would be. I'm always amazed that pilgrims were still coming to Jerusalem. That's what Jerusalem meant to people. That's how certain they were that even under siege from the Roman army, Jerusalem would not be destroyed. We're going to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem for Pesach in the year 70. Not a very good year to go to Jerusalem, but people were still coming. You see in front of you the direction of the attack. They attacked past the temple through the, not the old city, because the old city today is not the city that is attacked and destroyed. And then they turn around and they come back to the temple itself to destroy it on Tisha B'Av. The attack was brutal and bloody. Josephus records that the Romans kill over 1.1 million people in Jerusalem. And it culminates with the attack on the Jewish temple. Once the attack on the Jewish temple was complete, what happened? What took place next? The Talmud, one of the sections of Talmud that we're permitted to study today on Tisha B'Av itself, there's a limit to what you're supposed to study on Tisha B'Av. One of the sections of the Talmud describes quite significant detail what Titus did. Titus walks into the temple. He walks into the Beis HaMikdash. He walks right into the Heichal. The Jews remain absolutely convinced that Titus will not be able to walk into the Kodesh Kodashim. Why? Because what happens when you walk into the most holy place? You die. The Jews are thinking, if Nadav and Avihu, the children of Aaron, walked into the Kodesh Kodashim and died, Titus Harasha will not make it into the Kodesh Kodashim. The Gemara records what happens next. Ma'asa, what did Titus do? He walks right into the Kodesh Kodashim, no problem. That's when the Jews knew they were done. That's when they knew the Shekhinah, God had left the Kodesh Kodashim. Tafas Zona, he takes a prostitute, Biyado, v'nichnas lebeis kadshei kodashim, and he enters the Holy of Holies. And he commits a terrible sin, takes a Sefer Torah and commits a terrible sin in the Holy of Holies with the prostitute. V'natal sayef v'gides haparochas v'naseh nes v'hayam dam mevatz beit v'yotze. After he's finished committing the sin with the prostitute in the Holy of Holies, he turns around and takes his sword and he stabs the parochas. He stabs the curtain. And to his surprise, what happens? Blood pours forth out of the parochas. Ukesavur harag es atzmo. Seeing the blood, he mistakenly thought that he killed himself. It's a very strange language of the Gemara. What did he actually mean? He killed himself? Here, the term himself is a euphemism for God. Titus saw the blood issuing forth from the curtain in God's meeting place, the temple, and he took it as a sign that he had succeeded in killing God himself. What's going on? What's this story all about? It's a very painful story. But what's the message here? Like, what are we to understand? That the Roman general did a terrible act in the most holy place on a Sefer Torah and then stabs the paroches. So, struggling to try and understand, I wanted to look at the Kinnot itself as a commentary. There's a practice recorded in the Ramah that we remove the paroches from the Aron Kodesh. And we couldn't find anywhere that links these two stories, my chavruta and I. We were looking high and low. But to me, they're so obviously linked. Because what does the paroches do? The paroches protects that which is inside. It protects it. That's the point of the paroches. It keeps a certain amount of mystery around the Kodesh Kadosh. So dangerous was the Kodesh Kadoshim that in this case, it not only protected that which was inside, it also protects that which is on the outside. It protects the Jewish people. For if they were to walk into the Kodesh Kadoshim, they would die. And so the paroches is like a parent. It's a protector. It's to offer protection. And so what Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir does, the author of this Kinnot, he does something so profound. He puts two stories together from the same time period. Story number one in this Kinnot is the story of Titus, who walks into the most holy section and does the most terrible thing. And then stabs the parent, showing that there's no protection. The parent is dead. The parent is dead. And then he tells us another story about 400 children who are kidnapped and whisked away, taken against their will into slavery, what was probably going to be into the sex trade, with no protection. Their parents couldn't look after them. And it's a terrible story. It's a story we're familiar with. First half of the Kinnot says, "V'gideh paroches ba'alas shtei panim." He pierces the curtain, which was embroidered on both sides, right? The paroches, whenever you embroider a sheet, or there's a technical term for it, right? Whenever you embroider a cloth, one side is beautiful and the other side is all frayed. Not so with the paroches. Both sides were beautiful. So was the protection necessary for both sides, to protect that which was inside the Kodesh Kodashim and to protect that was outside. So when Titus was inside, all he saw was the beauty. He expected to see the back of the paroches, all the frayed stuff, but he saw all of the beauty. But the Jewish people were still innocent, even while the Beis Hamikdash was being destroyed, even while Titus HaRasha was doing the terrible sin in the most holy of places. Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir says that the Kohen Gadol went to sleep that night, thinking the next morning he would get up and do the avoda. Where does the Kohen Gadol do the avoda? In the Kodesh Kodashim. He's the one person who can go in there. He wakes up thinking the temple vessels will be ready. And how does the Kinnot conclude? The Kinnot concludes with the taking of 400 children, putting them on boats, and taking them back to the Roman Empire to be sold into slavery. You were enraged, you allowed the children's evacuation. Children that had no blemish were expelled from their home. They were protected by a paroches, and they were kidnapped by Titus. They were sent to a foreign distant land on 3 ships. Hashivenu, the Baal Kinnot says. They cried out, "Return us, shiv'u kav'u b'nivchei yam." As they sailed along the seas, they begged to go home. They begged for their mama. They begged for their papa. They begged to go home. But it was too late, and they recognized that. And rather than being sold into slavery, rather than lose their innocence, all together, they jumped into the city. And as they were jumping into the sea, Shir v'sishbachot shoreru ka'al yam. They were singing songs. And the author of the Kinnot says, you want to know what songs they were singing? We even know that. Ki alecha haragnu b'mitzulos yam. For your sake, we are slain upon the depths of the sea. These children remembered the splitting of the sea. And they jumped into the sea saying, we're going to sing like our ancestors sung at the sea. Rabbi Eliezer Kalir insists that we look at the story of Titus as a massive violation of innocence. And that we recognize that our job, wherever possible, is to protect that which is sanctified. We're now going to read the Kinnot written by Rabbi Eliezer Kalir, Kinnot number 16, page 360. So I'm conscious of the time. So I want to do our final two relatively quickly. Chana Senesh is an incredible story, incredible person. She was born into a well-educated secular Jewish Hungarian family in 1921 in Budapest. Her father, Bela Senesh, was a well-known playwright who died when she was 6 years old. She was raised by her mother, Catherine. At the age of 13, Chana begins keeping a diary and does so for the rest of her life. We're going to read excerpts from her diary. Though she was completely secular, she grew up completely secular, she was the subject of fierce anti-Semitism. And as a teenager, she joined the Zionist youth group called the Maccabiah, and she began exploring her Jewish identity. She quickly becomes a fierce Zionist, a proud Jew, and explores observance in various forms. Just so you know, Hannah herself is brilliant. She's a brilliant child. She attends one of the supreme elite academies in Hungary, where the tuition structure was Catholics pay one fee, Protestants pay double, and Jews pay triple. And when her mother couldn't afford tuition anymore, it was the teachers, the non-Jewish teachers, who lobbied the school administration to keep Hannah as a student because she was so beloved. She was recognized as a brilliant student, so she was given a tuition break. Instead of paying the Jewish tuition, she would have to pay the Protestant tuition. Instead of paying triple, she would have to pay double tuition. In 1939, after graduating high school at 18 years of age, she makes Aliyah to the British Mandate of Palestine. She settles in Kibbutz Sdot Yam, just south of Caesarea, a beautiful kibbutz on the Mediterranean Sea. One of the unique things about Hannah Senesh is we can learn her life in her words. She writes in her diary on July 17th, 1939, "Today is my birthday. I am 18. One idea that occupies me continually, Eretz Israel. There is but one place on earth in which we are not refugees, not immigrants, but where we are returning home, Eretz Israel." On kibbutz, she never forgets the Jews that she left behind in Europe, including her mother. She writes, 9 hours a day I stand and do the laundry, and I ask myself, is this all I can contribute? I feel a lot of unused power inside of me. Suddenly the idea grabbed me that I must go to Hungary and be there during these days, to lend a hand to the Aliyat HaNoar, the organization, and also to bring out my possible and vital and decide to rise and act. Writing in 1943. The idea of going to Europe stayed with Hannah, and a short time later, strange things happened. February 2nd, 1943, she writes, "Weird things happen at times. A month ago, I wrote a few words in my diary about the sudden idea that grabbed me, and just a few days ago, a member of the Palmach visited here. And during a conversation we held, he told me that a Palmach unit is being organized that was designated to do exactly what I felt needed to be done. The coincidence is eerie." And so 240 men and women were selected for the Palmach mission in Europe and went through rigorous training in Egypt. Training consisted of parachuting, weapons, radio, sabotage, and more. Of the 240 men, women, 26 passed, 24 men, 2 women, one of whom was Hannah. Hannah was assigned a mission, parachute with 2 other soldiers into Yugoslavia, cross the border into Hungary, and aid local partisans to the rescue Jews. Hannah writes the following on the plane to the kibbutz, members of the kibbutz: "Dear friends, on sea, on land, in the air, during war and during peace, we all have but one goal. Each and every one of us must stand his place. There is no difference between one duty and another. You are always in my thoughts because that's what gives me strength." So there are many legends what happens next. Some of the legends say that she parachutes into Yugoslavia with 2 other soldiers. They try to cross over the border. The 2 soldiers get scared. Hannah is determined. She's captured at the border and she's arrested. Another account says that they cross over the border successfully into Hungary. One of her other soldiers gets spooked, shoots himself, and that's how they're caught. Either way, Hannah is very quickly captured in Hungary and is imprisoned by the Nazis. It's in prison she writes the poem, "Eli, Eli, my God, I pray that these things never end, the sand and the sea, the rustles of the water, lightning of the heavens, and the prayer of man." Hannah is a beacon of light in the jail. The children that the Nazis arrested are taught to read and write. There are people in Israel today who know to read and write because they were taught by Hannah Senesh in jail how to do so. Hannah Senesh draws in the ground outside of her jail cell at Magen David. Hannah Senesh is tortured terribly because she has a radio transponder and she will not give up the code to the Nazis. Chana Sanish's mother is brought into jail and tortured. And they make an agreement. They won't give up the secret. Her teeth are removed, her fingernails are removed. Terrible things happen to Chana Sanish. In her last moments, they put a hood over her head. And she refuses. She says she wants her murderers to look her in the eye.
The first thing that must be understood is that it was even possible to destroy and execute a young, pretty girl. I can see her now, brown, disheveled hair, a military-type coat, and a brown skirt. That's how she stood, facing the fire. It was a terrible and frightening sight, and she crumpled after the shots.
Teljesen levő. Azt csináltuk, hogy összefogottunk, és ültünk egy párpercig. Együtt. Amikor tragikus halálhírét meghallottam, hát a megdöbbenésen kívül és élnek, talán még ma is élnek, és unokáik volnának, és dédunokáik volnának, egy ilyen fiatal élet kettétől.
My father was a businessman, and he was working in the field. And one day, the government member came to the field and just told him in very simple words that your sister was killed in Europe. It was a very sad meeting because they both didn't thought that they will meet together without her. The happiness couldn't be complete from that point. I don't think I can imagine my father and my grandmother talking about anything else. I'm sure they did. But in my mind, whenever they meet, the reunion recreated in Hannah.
זורק ממש, היא יכלה לעשות נגד היטלר.
על מה היא עשתה? זה מה שהדריך אותה, זה מה שהדריך כל כך הרבה אנשים בארץ, מה אפשר לעשות בשביל לעשות הגדולה?
ואנחנו רצינו את חנה לא כמלכירית, לא כגיבורה, אנחנו רצינו את החברה שלנו שהלכנו ואהבנו, ושרצינו שתזדקן איתם.
They say that it's very difficult to compete with the dead, because you can only say good things about them. I think that my father, he had to serve the memory of Anna. He had to help his mother in doing the work of memorial. And I think that his life was overshadowed. My grandmother was focused with all kind of memories. She was there, but not as a mother.
When I went to visit her, she lived in the old house, pictures all over. And it was like a shrine. She lived with them. Her whole life was really focused on them until she died.
כל הסיפור הזה לא מת, הוא חי. הוא חי. אותו אשרי גפרור הציק להבות ל50,000 צנחנים עד רגע זה. זה המספר. אז 50,000 להבות נדלקו. חלקן הלא קטן כנראה בגלל האתוס והסיפור של חנה סנש.
The conviction, the punch, the poetry, the dream combined in one person. And from the first step to the last one, strength and a heart full of sorrows.
Hannah Stenish was 23 years old when she was killed by Nazis. We're going to take a minute to recite two of the most significant Kinnos. Kinnot number 17, Kinnot number 21, page 374, page 415. Im Tachalna Nashim Piryam Ololeit Buchim. Outlining some of the most terrible things that happened in Jerusalem, and outlining some of the most courageous acts. Page 374 and 415. We're going to continue in 1 minute just to be able to finish the program timely. Please continue reciting the Kinnos while we continue. Again, page 374 followed by page 415. For our last personality of the morning, by way of conclusion, Dr. Fritz Haber is probably the most important person you've never heard of in so many ways. Who was Dr. Fritz Haber? Dr. Fritz Haber was born on 9th of December, 1868. He died the 29th of January, 1934. His Yahrzeit is the 13th of Shvat, Yud Gimel Shvat. He was born in Prussia into a respected, well-off, very secular Jewish family. He was brilliant. Received a doctorate cum laude in May 1891 from the University of Berlin. In the early 20th century, the world faced a massive crisis. Germany was the best example of this crisis. Germany's population at the time was 50 million people, and Germany only had enough food to feed 30 million people. Dr. Fritz Haber, who was a scientist, a chemist, was determined to solve this problem. So Haber would go on to study a variety of options, a variety of solutions, and he would make the most important discovery of the 20th century, and he would invent what's called the Haber process. In 1908, Dr. Fritz Haber invented a way for utilizing the vast supply of nitrogen in the air by bonding it to hydrogen to create ammonia, or fertilizer. Ammonia is then injected into the soil, where it is then converted into nitrate. Today, 290 billion pounds of ammonia is created through the Haber process. Right? The world would not have had the capacity to feed as many mouths as exist today. The capacity would have been 4 billion people at most. Today, the world has 7.7 billion people. Had Haber not invented his process, a lot of people would have gone hungry. In 1918, Haber is awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for creating the Haber process, for saving billions of lives. And at the award ceremony, none of his colleagues attend. It is one of the least attended Nobel Prize ceremonies in the history of the Nobel Prizes. Question is why? After Haber discovers the Haber process and refines it and changes the modern world that we live in, saves millions, billions of lives, what does he turn his attention to? What comes next after you've changed the modern world? His rise in the German aristocracy saw him appointed as a captain in the German army. And he is a very proud German. He is desperate for Germany to win World War I. Very quickly, at the beginning of World War I, 1914, Germany is running out of supplies. Within 60 days of the start of World War I, Germany is at its last feet. And Dr. Fritz Haber turns to his expertise to design the most powerful and the most deadly weapon the world had seen so far. The 22nd of April, 1915, the Battle of Ypres. Dr. Fritz Haber rushes to the front lines. If the Germans lose this battle, the war is over. The Germans have nothing left. They have no supplies left. They have no weapons left. They have nothing left. What turned out to be the most bloody of wars would have been over in 1 year instead of what it took. Haber rushes to the front line with his new weapon, ready to aid the German army in a massive confrontation with French forces. Dr. Haber himself is the first human in history to administer weapons of mass destruction. 168 tons of chlorine gas from over 5,000 gas cylinders in war were released by Dr. Haber himself, killing within 5 minutes 5,000 completely unprepared soldiers and injuring another 10,000. It changes the entire nature of the war. It is devastating to the French army. And Dr. Haber is a hero in Germany. He goes home, and a week later, there is a massive party in his home celebrating what he's done for Germany. He's put the enemy on the back foot. They never know when toxic gas is going to be released against them. All of German aristocracy comes to Dr. Haber's home, and him and his wife put on a good show. That night, he wants to leave, and he wants to go and administer more gas on the Eastern Front against the Russians. And his wife refuses. His wife is a pacifist. His wife says, if you leave, I'll kill myself. And that night, in the middle of the night, she goes out into the backyard, she takes the revolver, and she shoots herself in the chest. Their 12-year-old son finds her. The next morning, Dr. Fritz Haber boards a train for the Eastern Front so he can administer gas against Russian troops. Someone, same person who saves billions of lives, changes the entire trajectory of the world, making it possible to kill thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in a mere minute. A Jew from Prussia, brilliant Jew, a Nobel laureate. When he's awarded the prize in 1918, academics across the world protest. How could you give it to such a man? The father of chemical warfare, between genius and genocide. But Haber's story doesn't stop there. He runs a successful chemistry lab all the way into the 30s. In 1934, the Nazis shut down his lab and send out all of the scientists that he's employed, because he employs Jewish scientists. He's also a proud Jew. But he's permitted to stay and continue his work because he's a veteran, he's a hero. He refuses. He leaves the country in 1933, he goes to England. He ends up going to Switzerland, where he dies of a heart attack in 1934. There is an incredibly tragic conclusion to this story.
Now, there's a footnote to this that is very strange. I got a little, my dorsal hair stood up when I read the end of this.
Right. So during World War I, Haber's Institute had developed a formulation of insect-killing gas called Zyklon A, which was originally just a pesticide. Once again, another nitrogen compound. It was developed in his institute. He knew about it. In fact, his chemist had given this particular pesticide a smell. It was a warning smell, so that people didn't inadvertently breathe it in and get sick. But after the Nazis take over, this is after he died, they reach back to the shelf and they find this Zyklon stuff. And they ask for it to be reformulated to take out the warning smell. And it becomes Zyklon B, the killing gas of the concentration camps.
Did members of Haber's family die in the concentration camp?
Yeah, members of his extended family did, certainly friends of his did.
There's something deeply, deeply wounding, distressing, upsetting at the thought that he had anything to do with Zyklon B. But he didn't. The use of it, he couldn't have imagined. So, how do you feel about him now? Because, I don't know, I can't help but feel bad for the guy. Despite the chlorine gas, like, he didn't intend for that to happen. He could have never imagined that.
No, but there's part of me that says, here's a guy who just wanted to do everything better than had ever been done before, whether it was feeding or killing.
And he does.
And he does. But he does it with a kind of immoral athleticism, he does it without humility, without a lot of doubt. And it's a craft, but it's a craft with consequences. And to approach it with kind of crazy joy, I don't know. I would rather have scientists who carry doubt with them because they perceive pain.
Yeah, I agree with that. Maybe it's all about doubt.
Dr. Fritz Harper saves the modern world, gives us the ability to feed all the mouths that need to be fed, and also introduces the ability to kill tens of thousands of people in one shot. Right? The ability for humanity to be good, the ability for humanity to be evil, the ability for humanity to invent incredible tools and invent incredible destruction. Tisha B'Av draws into focus the tragedy, the destruction, the terrible things that have happened in our history, and reminds us that we're here to do good. Reminds us that we're here to do as much good as we can. We're going to conclude by doing a couple of things. We're going to conclude by singing the classic song that draws the contrast between B'tzeisi Mitzrayim and B'tzeisi Yerushalayim, how high we were, how good we were when we left Egypt, and how low we were when we left Yerushalayim. That can be found on page 515. B'tzeisi Mitzrayim Kinim Ira Laman Askira B'tzeisi Yerushalayim Az Yashim Moshe Shilo Yinashe B'tzeisi Mitzrayim V'konen Yirmiyav V'naneiya B'tzeisi Yerushalayim B'esi Hiskonen V'shachan Anan B'tzeisi Mitzrayim V'chamas Al Shachna Alai Kanana B'tzeisi Yerushalayim Gale Yom Ramu B'chachol Ma'kanu B'tzeisi Mitzrayim Zaydonim Shatafu V'aroshi Tafu B'tzeisi Yerushalayim Dagan Shemayim U'Metzur Mayim B'tzeisi Mitzrayim Lana U'Merorim U'Mayim Amorim B'tzeisi Yerushalayim Hashkem B'Ha'arev Stivivos Ha'chorev B'tzeisi Mitzrayim Korei El Evel Al Nar Rose Bavel B'tzeisi Yerushalayim U'Marek Kvod Adonai Ke'eshel Cheles Lefanai B'tzeisi Mitzrayim V'cherev L'tusha L'tevach Natusha B'tzeisi Yerushalayim Zevach Mincha B'Shemen Mishcha B'tzeisi Mitzrayim Skulas Alakucha Katzon Nativcha B'tzeisi Yerushalayim Chagim Shabbosos U'Mosim Ha'osos B'tzeisi Mitzrayim Tanis Ve'Veludov Ha'Evel B'tzeisi Yerushalayim Tuva Olim L'Arba Tegalim B'tzeisi Mitzrayim Olel Yishmaelim U'Machnos Arelim B'tzeisi Yerushalayim Yovel Shmita Ve'eretz Shoketa B'tzeisi Mitzrayim Machor Letznisos B'choros Lechrisos B'tzeisi Yerushalayim Kapores Ve'aron Ve'avnei Zikaram B'tzeisi Mitzrayim V'avnei Yakel La'ochlei Avela B'tzeisi Yerushalayim Leviim V'aronim V'shivim Zikanim B'tzeisi Mitzrayim Nokshim U'monim U'mochim V'konim B'tzeisi Yerushalayim Moshe Yireinu V'Aaron Yimcheinu B'tzeisi Mitzrayim Nebuchadnezzar V'Andrianos Keisar B'tzeisi Yerushalayim Naroch Nechama V'Adonai Shama B'tzeisi Mitzrayim Rachak Mimenu V'hinei Enenu B'tzeisi Yerushalayim Sistre Paroches V'Sidre Mareches B'tzeisi Mitzrayim Chemani Teves Alai Socheches B'tzeisi Yerushalayim Oh, los zvachim b'ishen nichochim etzeisim Mitzrayim b'cherem b'dukarim b'nei Tzion ha'yikarim b'tzeisim Yerushalayim b'riba gvos l'chavo nikba'os b'tzeisim Yerushalayim shrikas usruras l'kolam zos b'tzeisim Yerushalayim Zion Hazav Am Shel Varav B'Seisi Mimitzrayim Ushlach HaNezev Afar HaEzev B'Seisi Mirushalayim Kedusha Navua B'Seisi Mimitzrayim Urach Hatuma B'Seisi Mirushalayim Berina B'Shua B'Chatzos Haterua B'Seisi Mimitzrayim Zakas Olad B'Nakas Chala B'Seisi Mirushalayim Shulchan Menorah B'Chala L'Torah B'Seisi Mimitzrayim Elil v'toeva v'esel u'matzeva b'tzeisi mirushalayim Torah su'uda u'klei hachemda b'tzeisi mimitzrayim Sason v'simcha nasyagan v'yanacha v'shuvi Yerushalayim. We're now going to recite the Kinnot El Kedushay HaShoah. If you turn to page 635. Yeah, page 635. We're going to recite this Kinnot followed by Alei Tzion. Page 611. Alei Tzion v'yarecha, kimo isha v'tzireha, v'chivsula kagurasa, avial miyureha, alei armon asher nutash, v'ashmatzon adoreha, v'al bias mecharfei el, V'soch midash chadareha, alei galos mishar se'el, man'i meishiv zemareha, v'yal damam asher shupach, kemo mimei ye'oreha, alei hegyon mecholeha, asher damam yoreha, Bi'al va'ad asher shomein Uvito Sanhedreha, Ale Zivche Temideha, Uvid Yonei Bechoreha, Vial Chilud Geleicha, Mizvach Ketoreha, Ale Tabei Melacheha, B'nei David Gevireha, Ve'al Yapyam Asher Chashach, Ve'esaru Kisareha, Alei Kavod Asher Galot, Ve'es Charban Devireha, Ve'al Lochetz Asher Lochatz, V'som Sakim Chagoreha, Alei Machatz V'rov Makos, Asher Huku Nezireha, V'al Niputz Alei Selah, Ola Leha Ne'areha, Alei Simcha Sayeveha, V'sachta Mashevareha, V'al Inoi B'nei Chorin, Netiveha Tehoreha, Alei Besha Asher Asa, Selal Derech Ashureha, V'al Tzivos Kehaleha, Shezufeha Shechoreha, Alei Kalos Micharfeha, Beis Rabu Pigareha, V'al Rikshas Migatveha, Besov Mishkan Chatzereha, Alei Shimcha Asher Chulad, Defika Mei Metzereha, V'al Tachan Yitzav Chulach, Keshov Ushma Amareha, Alei Tzion V'yayela, Kimo Isha Tetzirah V'chiv Sudach Agurasak, Abba Neurah. Page 641. Asher Yeshvei Beisecha Yadav Chasela, Hashem Shekachada, Hashem Shekachada, Amen.